Where did synagogues come from and what were they for? Today, we're going to be talking to Dr. Jordan Ryan. He's a New Testament scholar and he does archaeology as well in the land of Israel. And he is going to tell us everything we ever wanted to know about synagogues and rabbis and where does all this stuff come from. You finish the Old Testament in your annual reading plan, you realize there are no synagogues, there are no rabbis. Where did these things come from? Well, he is going to help us understand the world in the time of Jesus, just before and a little bit after, about what's going on with synagogues and their purpose, mainly municipal, and why it also became religious. If you like what we do here at the Center for Hebraic Thought, the Biblical Mind podcast, you can tell somebody else about it. Forget about the 5-star rating for this week. If you've already done your due diligence, go tell somebody about the podcast. Maybe send them one that you particularly liked and tell them to sign up. Even I'll borrow an idea from a colleague of mine, Matthew Lynch. Maybe if you're at a restaurant, instead of leaving a tip, maybe you tell them, hey, try the Biblical Mind podcast for their tip, right? You get it, it's a tip, get it? You're tipping them off to this podcast. And of course, they'll appreciate that more than a 20% cash tip. You can also give at thebiblicalmind.org/give. And now to our episode.
I think probably the biggest one is the idea that synagogues are basically just like churches, but for Jews. Or that, and this is a related misconception, that ancient synagogues were basically the same as what modern synagogues are today. And the reality is that they're very different, especially in terms of layout and function. Form and function, kind of the two big ones. They're really different from both modern churches and modern synagogues. I'd say modern churches are much more similar to ancient churches than modern synagogues are, at least in the Western world, to what ancient synagogues look like. And there's a whole history of architecture behind that. But suffice it to say, while ancient synagogues were not laid out the way that modern synagogues or churches are, which tend to be, in kind of rows, like pews, basically facing the front, where there's kind of one main focal point. If anyone has ever had a chance to visit an ancient synagogue, one of the first things you notice is that it's kind of this like square or rectangular shape with benches, often stepped, that surround. So they're on all four walls. And so the focal point is in the center instead of at like the front of the room. There's sort of no front. It's just sort of like the center, and everyone's seated along the sides. And that right away is a pretty big difference. And I think the first time people sometimes go and see an ancient synagogue, they're often just surprised by how different it is from what they expected.
That's fascinating because every time I take a Christian group, if somebody stands in the synagogue, like a pastor, you'll see people stand. They'll stand where they think the front is.
Yeah.
They'll stand like it's in a church. But so it's a gathering around. It's called a synagogue. I mean, it can be called a Knesset or a Beit Knesset, a house of a gathering. Why do we call it by the Greek name? Do you know? Rather than why didn't the Hebrew or an Aramaic term catch on?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, obviously in modern Israel and, most Jewish contexts, they would still use Knesset or Bet Knesset and that kind of a thing. My sense, I don't entirely actually know the history of this, but I think it's a pretty good guess that the reason has to do with the fact that the New Testament's primary word for synagogue is synagogue. And so because of that, I think it's just the impact of the New Testament and possibly also just the Christian use of the Septuagint, where the few times that synagogue shows up, especially in like the Deuterocanonicals, it's usually synagogue. Sometimes it's ecclesia as well, which can be confusing. But that, I think, is the reason. I haven't seen a study of it to be sure, but that's got to be why.
Well, it's always perplexed me, but that singular idea makes a lot more sense to me, hearing it said out loud. Yeah, it's just Christians who pick it up and propagate it, and there became a lot of Christians very quickly. So where, there are no, well, maybe I should put it this question. Are there any synagogues in the Old Testament? Am I missing them? Or are there proto-synagogues?
So this is this is like the big debated question in synagogue studies, especially synagogue origins.
Hmm.
So traditionally, there's been this idea that synagogues came from the Babylonian diaspora, and that's kind of where they started. But the reality is we actually just don't have any ancient evidence for that. And it's, I think, kind of more of a modern inference than
Hmm.
anything else. I mean, it's an old theory, but it doesn't actually stem from the Hebrew Bible or Septuagint or New Testament or anything like that. What we do have in um, in Old Testament texts is the city gate.
Hmm.
So I'm thinking like specifically Ruth and
Hmm.
Job. You have the city gate complex, which in the ancient world isn't kind of just like an opening between, the walls or something. It's a whole complex with benches and things like that where the local council meets. And it's the place also in Nehemiah 8, the first public reading of Torah outside of the temple takes place in the Watergate in Nehemiah 8. So, all of the functions that we associate with synagogues in kind of the New Testament period and the early Roman period, and going forward, all of that seems to already have been taking place. So things like the reading of Torah, the gathering of councils, kind of public meetings, um, prayer, that sort of stuff all seems to take place in the city gate. And so scholars like Lee Levine has suggested that that's kind of the origin.
Hmm.
And so maybe the earliest, like if you want to say, here's something that is like so prototypical of what the synagogue becomes that we could say, yeah, this is like the synagogue with all but the architecture, then that Watergate reading of the Torah in Nehemiah 8 is sometimes pointed to as that's like maybe where it starts.
Yeah, I had never thought about that, but that tracks. Except for, I think for a lot of people, they're going to say, "Well, you didn't really mention singing songs of worship and clapping and reading script. Well, except for the reading of Torah in that one passage. But you just mentioned a bunch of like what I think we would call municipal functions. So how do
Oh,
you
right.
connect that to synagogue?
Yeah. So again, this is another way in which modern synagogues and ancient synagogues differ. Um, so ancient synagogues, especially in the Jewish homeland, so we're talking specifically like Galilee and Judea in the Roman period, and also we could say in the late Hellenistic period as well.
So
So
roughly 200 years before Jesus, 250 years
yeah,
up
so
to
I'd
the
say
time of Jesus.
we could kind of go from the early Hasmonean dynasty, so kind of that era. So I guess
Okay.
160s
Okay.
on BCE through till I guess the Bar Kokhba rebellion in the second century CE. So in that era, you have this whole region that's politically under the control of a mostly independent Jewish state to start with the Hasmoneans, and then you get the Herodian kingdoms and then the Roman state. So in that period, you have the whole region mostly still under control of Jews, even if they're not like, I know in the Roman period, obviously they're under the Romans, but they have control over their own cities and villages. And so what's happening there is you'll see synagogues playing this function as basically the town hall.
Hmm.
So a few scholars have used the term town halls with Torah
Hmm.
for the synagogues in the land of Israel itself. So again, especially Judea and Galilee, that really seems to be their function. They basically are the local place where your town council meets. They're the place where the law is read and interpreted. And you have to remember, in the New Testament period, so I'd say really Hellenistic, late Hellenistic, and early Roman periods, Torah is functioning basically kind of like statutory law. I know that's a little bit um, different from how it would have functioned earlier,
Hmm.
but if you break the law, there are consequences in the Roman period.
Yeah.
And so because of that, interpreting and reading the Torah out loud, we think of that as religious, but that would have been a really political thing as well. So it sort of makes sense. There are also law courts that comes up in the New Testament, prisons, charity institutions, they perform all those functions.
Yeah, we should stop there because I did put out a book arguing that biblical law is best understood as common law, and so
Mhm.
some people might be familiar with that argument. But the point you're making, excuse me, is by the time you get to the Roman period, like ideas about the law and legalism really become more concrete. They have their own views of the law, and some of that is surely
Yeah.
blending over into Jewish ideas about the law and their own. So they're reading their own Torah through their own cultural experience as well. Is that what am I reading you correctly?
Yeah, so I wouldn't be saying I'm not making any claims about the law as it was, intended or written, but the way that it functioned at the time, especially of the Hasmonean dynasty on, um, it begins to take on this function of basically being the constitution for the Jewish state. So you really see that if you look at like First Maccabees and Second
Hmm.
Maccabees, for example. Um, so again, not making any claims about earlier periods or anything like that, but um, interpreting the law definitely has this major sort of like political nature to it in the first centuries BCE and CE.
And that has largely stuck. I mean, Christians today will still look at the Old Testament law through that lens of, oh, it's just a bunch of rules that you either break the rule or keep the rule, and the more righteous person keeps the rules more. And yeah, so that's actually probably the one that we're most familiar with, but that is a newer, seemingly a newer reading in the Roman period. Um, so this blending also of the political, the government structure, or local governance, town councils, etc., and the reading of the Torah. Is there anything that we would call worship going on in the synagogues?
Yeah, so this is a really funny issue because I would say one of the most influential scholars of the ancient synagogue of the last generation, so Lee Levine, has this kind of famous line where he says that prayer is the most controversial issue in synagogue scholarship. And that's funny because obviously today it's a really big part of synagogue liturgy, and that develops quite quickly in the middle and later Roman period. So certainly not long after the New Testament, you get prayer going on
Mhm.
in some really structured ways. I would say, so to hedge my bets, I think the best way to put it is there was definitely something going on. We just don't know that much about it.
Hmm.
So there is one reference in the writings of Josephus to a prayer meeting um, that happened in Tiberias in the synagogue there. And this is a little bit more controversial, but one of the other terms for synagogue that comes up and does appear in the New Testament, in Acts 16, I think,
Mm.
in Philippi, is prosyuchi, which
Oh,
means, yeah, place of prayer.
right.
So the problem is that people sometimes see that and then want to kind of push it a little further. Um, I think the easiest way to put it is that prayer was definitely going on, and we know a little bit about it, but not very much, not to the extent that we know from the times of the rabbis and that kind of a thing.
Yeah, and even from the Gospels, prayer
Hmm.
is casually mentioned as part of, the regular ritualized life of a Jew. So something's going on there. Okay, maybe we should. I want to go back to the question eventually of where did these things come from as best we can. But I want to just walk through if I'm a man or a woman, and those might be two different ways. And what do I do? Like, okay, so during the week, I might have some municipal functions. I go and ask an elder to decide some case where I'm struggling with a neighbor or something. On Shabbat, which is where I think most people are thinking about the, Friday sundown, what am I going to do to go enter the synagogue? The best we know, our best guess. I realize I'm asking a historian and a guy who does archaeology, and so I'm going to get a lot of caveats. But the best you can guess, if I'm a man or a woman going to the synagogue, what's going to happen? Where am I going to go first? What am I going to do?
Yeah, you mean to sort of prepare like before you go in,
Yeah, yeah.
or
Before, can you just walk in the front or side door, or yeah? What do you have to do to go in?
yeah? So again, it's a little bit hard to say, but one thing that a lot of, I'd say, especially archaeologists, I think it's a little bit more debated amongst people who are more text based, but for a lot of archaeologists, the fact that a number of synagogues have been found near to stepped pools that
Hmm.
most of us would interpret as mikva'ot or ritual baths for purity purposes. The fact that they're often located nearby has led quite a few people to think that um, typically you'd be expected to bathe prior to entering synagogues. Now, again, yeah, caveat. So that is heavily debated
Hmm.
because we're not sure exactly what the relationship is between synagogue and the temple, which certainly purity was required there. Um, exactly what kind of sacred space a synagogue is also kind of a debated thing. Um, by the time of the rabbis, the Mishnah, you're seeing it take on certain, a status of sanctity. But what does seem clear is that there are a number of places where there is a large public mikvah located, or I should say, stepped pool located next to a synagogue. And in the case of Gamla, so that's a place in the Golan Heights. It was destroyed during the first Jewish revolt, and so it's kind of being left as it was on the day it was sacked by the Romans. And so what's there is all pretty much from the early Roman period. The synagogue there, the entrance is located right where there is a major, like large installation of a ritual bath. And
Hmm.
so a lot of scholars and especially archaeologists think that there has to be a connection between the two.
Yeah, I can imagine in the summers, or or I should say, 8 months of the year there, it would be no problem to go down to that bath. A few months, it would hurt
Yeah.
because it definitely gets cold even up in the Galilee and the Golan
Yes.
Heights. Um, and so the thought is that maybe there's some and if you say, well, why do they have a ritual I think most people don't realize baptism kind of already exists before the John the Baptist ever comes on the scene or some form of it.
Mhm.
Um, and I'm going to guess the presumption is here this comes from Levitical ideas of Levitical bathing and just extended into like, well, if I have to do it after I've had certain skin conditions, then maybe just better to do like a kind of a rule of duct tape is if one piece holds it, then 20 piece holds it really well just to cover your bases. Is that the idea?
Yeah, so you get some development for sure. So, um, it all starts with the ritual purity passages in Leviticus. That's kind of the genesis of it. But there is definitely a difference between the way that I think people would have thought of it in, Iron Age or maybe even
Mhm.
Persian period, Israel or Judah, versus like early Roman or late Hellenistic period, Judea and Galilee. And the big difference seems to be that there's this concept that God's people should live in purity as much as possible. Some of it also seems to be related to the fact that because impurity is transmissible, meaning that, like, if I'm impure and I touch you, then you're also impure. And again, it's not a sin status, it's just sort of
Mhm.
the way the world is. Um, and because it's transmissible, what can happen is that eventually you'll touch somebody who goes to the temple and then they'll render the temple impure. So there's this idea of trying to keep the people in purity as much as possible and that kind of a thing. And so the result is that in the second temple period, but really late, the tail end of it. So that's why I keep saying late Hellenistic, early Roman, you start to get all of these ritual baths just all over, to the point where it becomes really a signature for archaeologists of like Jewish settlements. So, for example, my current activation is at Tel Shimron
Mhm.
in Galilee near the Jezreel Valley, and we discovered a ritual bath right away in the first season. And so it became pretty abundantly clear that this was probably a Jewish settlement.
Just from the ritual bath alone.
Hmm.
And we've been saying stepped because presumably you go down on one side and come back on the other side. Is that's the thinking? I'm always wondering. Okay, that
Yeah.
makes sense, but where are people getting this from?
Yeah, it depends. So it's because they have, we call them step pools because they have, yeah, because they have steps. And
Steps
so
cut down into them. Yeah.
yeah, so you're walking down. That's the thing that they all seem to have in common, architecturally. There are some that for sure have two sides. I think especially public ones,
Mm.
where, because there's some that are private, like in people's basements and things like that, especially in Jerusalem. But there are these public ones that they're really big. And so there's like a divider going up and down the steps, usually made of like plaster. And so you go down one side, enter into the water and become pure, then come up the other side. And so the idea seems to be, a lot of people think it's to make sure that, you don't bump into the people who are impure who are going in, and then you have
Right.
to kind of do it all
Defeat
over
the whole
again.
purpose, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Is this the thinking of I haven't tracked this closely, but the pool of Siloam at the bottom of the hill of the city of David, is it that people would be doing some kind of mikveh baptism as they go up to the Temple Mount?
Yeah. And I mean, again, it's a step pool. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, typically it's been seen ever since the discovery as a really large ritual bath.
Okay. Okay, so you may at some point in history, you may start going into this ritual bath before you come into the synagogue. Uh, that just means, does that mean everybody's wet in the synagogue? Like, the synagogue would have been a
Yeah,
wet experience? Like, like, you think of,
of
like, a
course.
day at the water park, I think, okay, you're, like, wet and dry.
Yeah, I never I never thought about that before. I mean, mikvahs are still in use today in certain forms of Judaism for
Mhm.
sure. So I don't know exactly what the process is in the modern world, but I'm sure it's not that different from what it was in antiquity. Um, I would think they would dry off. In some cases, I do want to say also that a lot of this is really hedging, because
Right.
there are some synagogues where it's not clear that there's a mikveh nearby.
Hmm.
And I do think there is some difference between different Jews in this period as to, like, when you enter a ritual bath, and for what purpose. And but let's say in Gamla, where there is a big ritual bath right next to the synagogue and they seem to be connected, um, you'd think that people would want to dry off first, but there is also in that synagogue at Gamla a water channel inside the synagogue itself,
Hmm.
which is not talked about very often, but it's there in the excavation reports. There's a lot of discussion as to exactly what that was for. It is interesting that you get these references in rabbinic writings. So we're talking a little later now.
Mhm.
Um, to the idea that sacred texts soil your hands, that they render your hands impure,
Oh,
because there's this whole debate as to whether Esther soils the hands. Um, but and so there's this idea that maybe there was hand washing involved inside the synagogue as well. But that is really uncertain for the early
right.
Roman period. But there's so there's water inside the synagogue as well for some purpose that we just don't understand.
Wow. I mean, I love this because it demonstrates all kinds of innovations on some very clear teaching in the Torah about various
Mhm.
ways in which you're supposed to be pure and how you can be purified. Sometimes you just have to wait overnight and it's a timeout purity issue. And sometimes you have to bathe. Sometimes you have to shave and bathe and offer sacrifices. But that they're extending the logic of those in various ways. And it might not be uniform, right?
Yeah.
Different traditions and different communities might develop. So you might have some rabbi that's obsessed with water purification. He brings a water channel into Gamla or Qumran down the Dead Sea
Mhm.
Scroll community. They, again, they had the duct tape rule seemingly that you can't baptize enough. Um,
Right. Yeah.
the other innovation here too is for the New Testament is I assume is moving from self baptism to reception baptism as well. That would have been the weirding of baptism for John the Baptist is that you cannot give it to yourself, you have to receive it. Is that your understanding?
I think the biggest innovation, that people point to, and I'm starting to get a little outside my expertise here, but because I'm not a John the Baptist guy, but my understanding is that one of the big innovations is that it's a baptism for remission of sins,
Right,
which is definitely not what the mikveh is, right? And I
right.
think that's also where some Christian readers sometimes misunderstand maybe what a mikveh is. I know certainly my students, when we go to Israel and visit places like Magdala, where there's a couple of really well preserved
Mhm.
mikvahs, they think that this is how you could become kind of clean from sin, but it's
Right.
really not that. Purity and impurity is not really a sin state.
Yeah, the issue of purity, and I wish I don't think we have any good English words, but it just gets mixed up in people's heads because impure just sounds.
Mhm.
I mean, sin and impure get lodged together for a lot of people. Um, okay, so we're gonna go into the synagogue now. I just thought your next monograph should be called "Moisture in the Synagogue," and because you got to
That'd
work
be
that one
really
out.
interesting.
That's gonna bug me for a while. Also, if it's hot, sitting there letting water wick off of you might not be the worst thing in the world as well.
True.
Um, but you're sitting in the synagogue, then what are you doing on Shabbat? What's our best guess?
Yeah, so there we start to get a little bit more in terms of like hard sources. So we have people like Josephus and Philo who talk about things that went on in synagogue settings. And we also, of course, have the New Testament. Luke 4 in particular gives us a really good example of what kind of thing might have happened in a synagogue. So there's a couple things that are pretty common across all of our accounts. And one of them is the reading of what at the time would be considered Jewish scriptures. So in particular, the Torah seems to almost always there's some Torah reading. And that's pretty well most of our accounts include this.
Mhm.
Even some of the accounts that don't directly mention it. So I'm thinking here, John chapter 6, there's a story that takes place. It's the bread of life discourse, Jesus in the
Mm,
synagogue at Capernaum. And it's interesting because it doesn't tell us directly that they read from a passage of the Torah, but then they're spending a whole lot of time talking about the manna incident.
mhm.
And so it seems like in some way what they're doing is in response to a reading that happened that just isn't narrated. Um, Torah readings are basically that's foundational for the Sabbath gathering, so far as we can tell. But there's also these references, and I mean, the New Testament does it too, either studying or reading aloud not only the Torah but also the Nevi'im, so the prophets.
Right.
And so there is also archaeological evidence for this because there's a synagogue that was discovered at Masada. That
Mm,
was so the rebels who occupied it basically converted a stable or something into a
right.
synagogue. And there's a little area that was used. Somebody lived in this little area, and there was a little kind of pit. Some people like to say that it was a geniza, but I don't know. It's hard to say.
Right.
And in that little pit, there were some texts. So obviously associated with the synagogue. They're in the building, just in this kind of little closet kind of area. And one was a fragment of Deuteronomy, and I think if I remember right, the other one's a fragment of Ezekiel.
Mm,
So you have actually both Torah and Nevi'im. They're actually like directly found in a synagogue
mm.
context. And the New Testament mentions this as well. Jesus reads from Isaiah, of all texts, in Luke chapter 4, and you get Paul debating in the diaspora synagogues about the law and the prophets.
Yeah. Excuse me. So I wonder also if they're reading the Torah. This is a genuine question of mine.
Hmm.
So okay, you have the Torah reading, and then you can fill in your imagination. And then what do they do? So we finish the last line of Numbers or whatever.
Yeah.
And I can't imagine that they're just going to sit there quietly and meditate, as we might think of it, on the Word of God. In my mind, like this is when the discussion starts, but maybe
Yeah.
not. And maybe it'd be good to talk about the role of the rabbi. Where do rabbis come from, and how is this guided or unguided time, or is it just a free for all? What do you
Yeah.
think?
So this is where I think it gets really interesting, actually. So yeah, you're right. The reading isn't the end. It's just the beginning. They're just getting started. So after the reading, there does seem to be this expectation. Basically, all of the narratives that we get, um, there's some sort of discussion that takes place afterwards, which is kind of like, I mean, today we might call it something like a sermon, but I mean, it's maybe a little different because what
Mm,
it is so it's teaching or interpreting, I would say,
mm,
the passage. Now, the thing is that um, it seems like the person who reads is expected to interpret. And so we see that happening. So the Luke 4 example, Jesus reads from the scroll of Isaiah. He seems to choose the passage as well, which is sort of
right,
interesting. He's given the scroll, but he's not told what part of it to read
right.
from. And he actually jumps around, which is attested. So there's Isaiah, what is it, 58 and a bit of 61, or the other way around, 61 and a bit of 58 inserted, and jumping around in the prophets, at least for the readings, attested in the early rabbinic writings as something that people do. You don't do it in the Torah, but you
Hmm.
can do it in the prophets. And that's part of the interpretation as well, right? So
Hmm.
I'm saying this because the reading itself is actually part of this like interpretive process. So I think it kind of reminds me of times, especially in evangelical churches, where the pastor will read the main passage, and then they'll like have some other kind of passage that seems unconnected that they want to talk about, that they kind of read
Hmm.
alongside it, that isn't necessarily like the lectionary or anything. It's a
Yeah.
little like that. Um, and then you get, usually it seems like the person who reads then is supposed to interpret, which is again the Luke 4 passage. Everyone's kind of waiting for Jesus to do something after he gives the scroll back,
Hmm.
and then he does. So he gives them an interpretation, and then discussion follows that. So one scholar, Donald Binder, he has this really memorable line where he says that um, reading and teaching the Torah was not for the faint of heart in the ancient synagogue, because the idea is sort of, well, you read it and then you give your interpretation, and then everyone's supposed to come at you
Right.
and to question it. And I kind of like that
Yeah.
idea
Me
personally,
too.
um, because it's a community effort. I mean, very kind of first century Judaism. It's a community effort, and no one sort of gets just to lay down the law for you. You get checked. And um, again, all the New Testament passages, you see that going on. Whenever there's reading or teaching or
Mm.
interpretation of the law of the prophets, there's extended discussion. And sometimes it can start out going well, like that passage in Luke 4, and then take a turn.
Yeah.
At the beginning, they really like his interpretation, and
Yeah.
by the end, they really don't.
They might want to
Um,
run you out of town and kill you. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
exactly.
that's always, yeah, that is a great way to look at it. And no, I often think, man, what if we just did a little bit of this in a church
Hmm.
situation? Also, if you ever handled a Torah scroll, I don't think I've ever handled a prophet scroll, but I'm just thinking like the awkwardness of the pause while Jesus is like trying to
Oh,
manipulate the
yeah,
scroll to get to the other place. Like, just give me a second. I know it's in here somewhere, right?
yeah.
And you can't say turn to Isaiah 58, right? You just have to like shimmy your way over there with the scroll. Um, okay, so there's going to be some scroll. There's going to be some Torah. There's going to be some prophets, possibly psalms, possibly the singing of psalms. We certainly have indirect evidence of the singing of psalms in the early Jewish church in the New Testament. Do we have any? Is that standard practice at that point? I mean, we know it's certainly at the temple we have standard practice,
Hmm.
but in the synagogue itself,
It's one of those things where, yeah, probably, but there's no direct evidence in the same way. And the other thing to remember is that what they considered Nevi'im. So we definitely
oh yeah,
have um, this idea that like you read the prophets as well as the Torah at times, but the Psalms sometimes are Nevi'im,
right.
prophets. Right, David is a prophet and all of that. So it seems like it's quite likely, I'll say, that Psalms were read and probably sung and discussed, just like the prophets were.
That makes sense. Okay, so I want to come back to this structure because you opened with form and function, which is a fantastic way to think about a synagogue. That the form follows the function in some way. Um, so where do rabbis come from? And then we'll think about, well, what are your thoughts about the form or the function that eventually ends up being, which shaped which? Or I mean, obviously they both shape each other over time, but so where are rabbis from? We never hear about rabbis in the Old Testament. The best we get are what elders and maybe judges, but judges are even a little bit too formal for. So
Yeah.
what's a rabbi and where do they come from?
Yeah, so this is kind of a complicated issue because, okay, so here's the big issue that I think a lot of Christians run into when reading the New Testament. So there is this term which means, my great one, Rabuni or Revi, right? So something like, my great one. which is applied to teachers in this period. And so Jesus, gets that title at different points in the New Testament and things like that. However, in the Jewish tradition today, but also in antiquity, there is also the rabbinic movement,
Mm.
which comes out of they're the sages, right? So
Right.
it's the wisdom of the sages, and they're a specific movement within Judaism that I would say is sort of the ancestor of modern Orthodox Judaism. That is, most scholars think, in some way a continuation of Pharisaic
Hmm.
Judaism, or kind of a development from Pharisaic Judaism. Um, at least that's the kind of long-standing scholarly default position. And so um, that movement so their sages are often called rabbis, and so the specific sages often are referred to in their texts as the rabbis. So when we talk about the rabbis, we're talking
Hmm.
really about the sages, and that is a different thing from sort of people who were teachers in the late Second Temple period. These people would have been teachers as well, but
Right.
that doesn't mean that they're the same, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um,
So
so they're
if I hear you right,
related.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you
That's
off.
okay.
There's kind of a formalization of an office of rabbi that become the collection that end up in these debates and arguments that form the Mishnah and the Talmud, the sacred interpretations and arguments about what the Torah means and more.
Right.
But in the time of Jesus, you're really like, there's a reason why Jesus can just be called a rabbi
Yeah.
without seeking out that profession, as it were.
Right. And so there's no like ordination
Right.
process or anything like that. And you really see this in the New Testament. Like Jesus sort of just gets up and teaches.
Hmm.
And so he becomes a teacher because it's what he's doing. Um, and he wouldn't have been the only person. One thing that is really clear from the New Testament, but also from other sources, is that scribes often performed the function of teacher in the synagogue. And that makes a lot of sense because they're people who are just professionally literate, right? Their job
Right.
is to read. So that makes sense. And you have also priests. People, I think, often think the priests in the Second Temple period are just located in Jerusalem. I mean, that's not true at all. They're all over the place, and they go to Jerusalem for their specific periods when they're serving, but they're all over the land the rest of the time.
Hmm.
And so they're also in synagogues. We get references to them in synagogue contexts and inscriptions and things like that. Um, and we also have um, references to two different offices, one called the Chazan, or or the Hyperetes in Greek, again in Luke 4. So that's still a position that's around
Hmm.
today. That's somebody who's sort of in charge of, in the ancient um, synagogue at least, somebody who's in charge of sort of ensuring that the service goes well. They're basically the master of ceremonies.
Right.
And then you have the archysynagogos, so that is, again, synagogue ruler is the literal meaning. Um, Rosh Knesset in Hebrew,
Hmm.
just the head of the synagogue.
Right.
And that's like the president, basically, of the synagogue.
Is
It's
it the one who sits in the seat of Moses
maybe,
that we thought was metaphorical, but then until they found one, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, Chorazin. We don't know.
Yeah.
It's a high office, but it really seems to be a benefactor.
Hmm.
So it's somebody who's like paid a lot of money basically and kind of is bankrolling the whole operation. And that comes with a certain amount of respect in the ancient world. So what exactly they did is we're still not entirely sure what their role was. But
Hmm.
those are kind of the offices in the synagogue. So it's a little bit different from synagogues today, and certainly really different from like ecclesial structures in the church today.
Well, if I hear you right, there's just a lot more going on in an ancient synagogue than there. It's kind of like a church today. Synagogues are, basically maintained for religious services, but not all the other functions as much. I guess it's mixed. Okay, I want to come back to that very first thing, the shape of the synagogue,
Right.
the fact that they're spread. I mean, you've been talking about synagogues still kind of in the land within quick pilgrimage to Jerusalem. how far out do we find synagogues, in the time of Jesus? Like, how far out were Jews building these things, and did they look the same everywhere, or were there very dramatically different synagogues in different places?
Yeah, so I mean, basically anywhere where there's a Jewish community, there was a synagogue. Now that doesn't always mean a building, but
Mm.
typically, kind of older scholarship tend to assume that they weren't buildings. Nowadays, I think we tend to assume that there was likely some kind of building as a gathering place, um, but it doesn't have to be the case. So anywhere where there is a Jewish kind of community gathering, um, you could consider that a synagogue, even if it's in the open air. But
Okay.
you definitely get synagogue buildings all over the place. And I've argued this, but I think a lot of people have now, and I think it's really become the most common scholarly position is that synagogue buildings are far more common than we thought.
Mm.
So we find synagogues in the diaspora all the way out. So, for example, there's been quite a few discovered in Greece. There are references, the Bosporan kingdoms and things like that. So basically, anywhere where there's a Jewish community, they don't have to be located in the land of Israel itself. Um, the in terms of form, so the synagogues in Galilee and Judea, again, the main thing is there's this main assembly hall that's this kind of quadrilateral shape, and you have benches along the walls that are often stepped. And that comes from actually the world of Greek architecture. It comes
Mhm.
from the Boulateria, which is so that's the Greek council hall, basically.
Mm.
And that means that unsurprisingly, you find that same architectural form in diaspora synagogues, because it's actually coming not just from Galilee or Judea or something like that, but from all across the kind of Hellenic world. Um, and you do get some interesting things in the diaspora, though, which makes sense. Regional architecture is kind of what
Mm.
it is. And so, one of the things that some people have noticed is that there seem to often be a similarity between association buildings, which
Oh,
are
yeah.
clubs or guilds in the Greco-Roman world, and synagogues. So you'll still get that assembly hall, but one thing that's really common for clubs and guilds, so associations, is eating areas, like a triclinium, which is
Mhm.
a kind of Roman dining hall. That's super common in association buildings, and they are attested in some synagogues. So there's a famous synagogue at Ostia, for example, near
Oh,
Rome.
outside of Rome, yeah, okay.
Yeah. And the date of it is disputed, but let's say it's late Roman. But still, either way, there's a really good example there of like a triclinium. Jericho, Ehud Netzer found a building. It's being debated as to exactly if it's a synagogue because it's a little bit weird. But it does have, even though it's in the land, it has a triclinium, a dining
Mm.
area, and that seems to be because it was also an association, um, because the building seems to be being built for people who worked in the palace, like for palace workers at
Okay.
Jericho. So yeah, so it seems like there's some variation, but a lot of the time it's based around these different kind of Greco-Roman building forms.
Well, and that makes sense, and well, at least to me, like basilica was also a public meeting
Yeah,
space that gets adopted by later Christianity after Constantine. Um, and maybe it's just a minimally efficient way to get a lot of people in a room together where they can all
yeah,
hear and yell at each other if they need to. Um, the triclinia, these are the rooms that have like three benches on each, or on one bench on each side, or three sides, I guess
yeah,
is I think of tri-reclinia.
yeah. That
But
I mean that makes
yeah.
sense. Yeah, three couches kind of around a table.
And early churches in the Roman Empire were often sometimes meeting in these triclinia as well, right?
Yeah,
From what I hear. Well, that's very helpful. So I think you've painted a landscape where even now watching. So can maybe now we can come back to Jesus and have him, because you're an expert in the time of Jesus here. Um, Jesus walks into a synagogue, not a joke. Um, Where does he sit? Do we know where he sits? Is there like some Orthodox communities, there's a male and a female side, or some of them the males are in front, the females are in back. Um, and I guess is it fair to say that like maybe Jesus took a mikvah bath before he dipped himself in the mikvah bath and it goes in? Or how far, if you're there with students doing a teaching trip, how far do you push the image of here's Jesus walking into this synagogue, here's what he would have done?
Yeah, I guess I'm like always super careful. Well, the reason is because usually when I'm there with students, they're not just my students at Wheaton College. So
Oh.
yeah, so I'm because they're from our excavation. So we have Jewish students and sometimes Muslim students and often Mormon students as well.
Mhm.
We work with BYU on our site. So yeah, I'm always super careful with what I say, but
Fair.
about Jesus. But if I was to kind of imagine it, what I think, so I think Jesus, going into a synagogue, it's a little tricky because Jesus is there's a certain kind of person, and we see this again in some of the rabbinic texts. These teachers who kind of go around like these
Right.
peripatetic guys who just kind of um, but he goes into in the synagogue in his hometown in Nazareth, and also where he's living in Capernaum. So, if we imagine it's a place that he's familiar with, typically, I think what you would do is, again, you've got these buildings that are laid out with these different benches. Why are the benches along the walls instead of all facing one direction like we have in modern basilicas or a lot of even ancient basilicas? Well, the answer seems to be that form of the synagogue facilitates one thing in particular, which is discussion. And remember how we
Mhm.
mentioned that earlier, not discussion with the people who are seated next to you, but what the forum facilitates is discussion with people seated across from you.
Mm.
And I'm Canadian. And so I've said this a few times in publications, but it always reminds me of the Canadian House of Commons.
Mhm.
If anyone's ever seen that on TV, or the British House of Commons, or whatever they call it there, House of Parliament, um, where you've got the back and forth, uh, people seated on two different ends, and it facilitates that kind of like cross room discourse. So what
Uh,
I think is you probably went into the synagogue and you sat with the people you were most likely to agree with,
hmm.
and across from the people that probably you didn't. Um, and but this is a testament to the fact. I'm not saying that all Jewish communities were super divided.
Right.
Um, they all got together in the same place and hashed these things out. And sometimes they were all of one accord and things like that. And other times they weren't. But it seems like they're kind of you'd sit with your clan and or your party, so to speak, and across from the people that you disagreed with. And that gets at another thing that you mentioned. So this question of seating for men and women. Um, so in modern Orthodox synagogues, there is, differentiated seating for men and women. So they don't sit together. There's like often a gallery or something like that. Um, there's no archaeological evidence for that until the medieval period.
Hmm.
Um, and so there's also not really textual evidence in the Second Temple period for the division of men and women in ancient synagogues at all. And actually, there's evidence to the contrary, including in the New Testament. So just to take a New Testament example, you get this reference in Luke 13. Jesus just runs into a woman in the synagogue um, somewhere in Judea. We're not told exactly where, who has a bent back, and he heals her. That presumes that whole story turns on them being in the same space.
Yeah.
We also know that women could serve in some of those offices. So there's a few different inscriptions of that name female archaeosynagogai, so female heads of synagogues. So it seems like they're sort of all just together there in those spaces. Exactly when this tradition of separating out men and women comes into practice, we're not sure. Probably the
Mm.
medieval period, maybe late Byzantine.
Okay, one last question. I have many more, but I'm going to restrain myself. Jesus grows up in Nazareth, in eyeshot of the city of Sepphoris. Do you think he went down to Sepphoris? Tiberias is being, I guess, under construction and during his lifetime, but he's a builder,
Mhm.
and there's a big city where there's work. You have Tiberias where they're building it. Do you think he visits these cities? Um, Or why do you think it's just they're not even mentioned in the New Testament? I'm looking for your hot take here too.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, this has been like a perpetual question in New Testament studies. It is weird. Tiberias is mentioned like once because the
Right.
Lake of Tiberias.
Right.
So there are these major cities in the area, and Jesus doesn't seem to care that much about going to them, or they're not mentioned at least.
Hmm.
So I do think, I mean, I'm pretty convinced based on just like narratives that we get of this period, and even rabbinic texts, people seem to be going all over the place. I mean,
Right.
just to use the rabbis as an analogy, there are like traveling rabbinic teachers in those texts. It seems to be pretty common. People certainly traveled for work. In the ancient world, too, there's references to people who live in cities but work on farms or own farms that they
Oh,
also work on that are outside the city. So we know people are traveling all over the place. And, even just the pottery that travels around, we know comes from different places and things like that. So my guess is it's close. At some point, I'm sure Jesus, I think it's a good inference, maybe is a better way to put it,
okay.
that Jesus probably went there. Tiberias is maybe different because so the road that
Right.
takes Jesus along actually goes through. So Magdala was Tarakia um, in the ancient world, and the road actually goes through there, going from either Nazareth or Cana. He would have had to done a detour to go to Tiberias.
Right.
So it might just not have been convenient.
Yeah.
Um, but the hot take has always been that, but those are also kind of the places where Herodian soldiers would have been, and who are
Uh,
for military. And we know that Herod Antipas is looking for Jesus. So there's that narrative in Luke about that. Um, and he also thinks that he's John the Baptist, come back to
right.
get him, something from the dead. So, he executed John the Baptist. So it does also make some sense to try to avoid places where there are definitely soldiers present or,
Hmm.
members of the military. John the Baptist has a ministry to soldiers, but I actually can't think of a narrative where Jesus does.
Hmm.
Uh, and I'm, this is just off the cuff. So maybe I'm just not thinking of something, but well, there's the centurion.
Centurions and the Roman guard. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's the centurion at Capernaum. Um, so there's that, but again, that's he's not
The
seeking
Romans
that
aren't
guy
going to
out.
care about what Herod is trying to get. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, and he seeks Jesus out, not the other way around.
Yeah.
Whereas John the Baptist specifically is like preaching to soldiers.
Hmm.
So there's a slight difference there. So I do wonder if because of the whole Herod Antipas thing, I mean, that's the hot take. I
Yeah.
think the safe answer is they're not on the right roads that we know he's traveling on. But
Right.
Magdala is.
And yeah, coming out of Nazareth, like, it's pretty, physically speaking, it's pretty dead obvious that the road is going dumping straight into Magdalene. You can actually
Yeah.
say it would have almost been impossible for Jesus to have missed this town, right?
Yeah.
Um, well, Dr. Jordan Ryan, thank you so much. I have so many more questions, and maybe other people do too. And maybe we can have you back on if people want to email us questions more, because I think you can free fire here. Thank you for your wisdom and guiding us through ancient synagogues.
Yeah. My pleasure. Always a pleasure.